Why you co-mapry yourself to others. Have you ever looked at someone else's life and suddenly felt like your own wasn't enough? Maybe you opened Instagram for just a few minutes and somehow ended up questioning your looks, your success, your relationships, even your future. Here's the strange part. Nothing in your own life actually changed. The only thing that changed was what your brain chose to compare. Psychologists have found that the human brain naturally compares itself to other people. It's a survival mechanism that once helped us understand our place within a group. But in today's world, your brain isn't comparing itself to a few people. It's comparing itself to thousands. Carefully edited photos, highlight reels, perfect careers, perfect relationships, perfect lives. And without realizing it, you begin measuring your real life against someone else's best moments. So why does your brain keep comparing you to everyone else? Why is someone else's success so often interpreted as your own failure? And more importantly, can you stop comparing yourself and finally start appreciating your own life? By the end of this video, you'll understand the psychology behind social comparison, why your brain constantly measures itself against others, and several research-backed strategies that can help you break free from the comparison trap. Welcome back to the channel, or if this is your first time here, welcome. I'm a psychologist, and today we're exploring one of the biggest reasons people struggle with confidence, happiness, and self-worth: the psychology of comparison. We'll uncover the neuroscience behind comparison, why social media makes it worse, a real story from my practice, and practical techniques that can help you stop comparing and start living. If understanding the hidden forces shaping your inner life is something you care about, make sure you're subscribed, because every week we explore the psychology behind behavior, emotions, relationships, and the invisible patterns that shape our everyday lives. Now, let's begin with one simple question. What if the person stealing your happiness isn't someone else, but the comparison happening inside your own mind? Let's start at the very beginning, because the most important thing to understand about social comparison is the same thing we've said about so many of these patterns on this channel. It isn't a character flaw, it isn't vanity, and it isn't something that only insecure or shallow people experience. It is, at its root, one of the most deeply wired social evaluation mechanisms in the human brain. And it exists for reasons that once made enormous evolutionary sense. In a small, interdependent tribal group, knowing where you stood relative to the people around you, who was stronger, who was more skilled, who had more resources, who was more valued by the group, was genuinely useful, actionable information. It told you where to invest effort, what skills to develop, where potential threats or alliances might come from, and how secure your position in the group actually was. Your brain developed comparison as a social navigation tool, and for most of human history, it worked reasonably well for that purpose. The problem, and it's a significant one, is that this system was calibrated for a world in which you were exposed to somewhere between a few dozen and a few hundred people across your entire lifetime, people you knew personally, whose actual lives you had real, accurate information about, whose struggles and failures were as visible to you as their successes. Today, that same comparison mechanism is being applied to thousands of carefully curated, strategically presented, professionally filtered glimpses of other people's highlight reels, with absolutely none of the context, the struggle, the failure, the doubt, or the ordinary difficult reality that surrounds those moments. Your brain is running a piece of evolutionary software that was built for a small village on a digital platform that exposes you to millions of people's most impressive moments every single day. And it genuinely cannot tell the difference. Here's where the research gets specific and genuinely illuminating. Psychologist Leon Festinger, who first formally described social comparison theory in the 1950s, identified two primary directions comparison tends to run: upward comparison, comparing yourself to someone you perceive as doing better, having more, being further along than you, and downward comparison, comparing yourself to someone you perceive as doing worse. Both of these, interestingly, can be either motivating or damaging depending on the context and the mindset you bring to them. Upward comparison can inspire, or it can devastate. Downward comparison can provide temporary relief, or it can generate guilt and shame. What Festinger and decades of subsequent research has found was that the most psychologically costly form of comparison is the one most amplified by social media. Upward comparison applied to domains that feel personally significant, where the gap between you and the person you're comparing to feels like a verdict on your worth rather than simply a description of a difference. There's also a deeply important phenomenon called the fundamental attribution error of comparison, which isn't a formal research term, but describes something I see constantly in clinical practice. When we compare ourselves to others, we almost universally compare our complete, unfiltered, internal experience with all its doubt, anxiety, struggle, and messiness to other people's curated, external presentation. We see their finished product and compare it to our rough draft. We see their confident public face and compare it to our private uncertainty. We see their highlight and compare it to our entire film, including every deleted scene and outtake. This comparison is structurally unfair in a way that makes it almost impossible to win, because you are the only person in the world whose internal experience you have direct access to, which means you will always know your own struggles more vividly and completely than you know anyone else's. A third dimension worth examining is something researchers call relative deprivation. The experience of feeling worse about something you have, not because it's objectively bad, but because someone else has more of it. Studies on this are remarkable. People consistently report lower satisfaction with objectively good outcomes, a solid salary, a comfortable home, a healthy relationship, when they're exposed to others who have slightly more. Olafai, compared to situations where they're not making that comparison at all. This means your brain's happiness with your own life isn't determined solely by the actual quality of your life. It's significantly shaped by what your brain chooses to use as a reference point. And in a social media environment, those reference points are constantly being set at unrealistically high levels. If any of this is resonating with you so far, go ahead and drop a comment telling me which domain you compare yourself to others most in: appearance, career, relationships, finances, or something else entirely. I read through these regularly. And if this video is helping you see your own comparison patterns more clearly, take a second to hit that like button. It genuinely helps this reach more people who might need to hear it today. I want to tell you about a patient I worked with. I'll call her Jade. She was 28 years old, a junior architect, talented and by every objective measure doing well for her age and experience level, who came to me because she had developed what she described as an inability to feel genuinely good about anything she accomplished for more than a few hours. She would finish a project she was proud of, feel a brief flash of satisfaction, and then open her phone, see a peer's work being praised online, and the satisfaction would simply dissolve. By the time she reached me, she had largely stopped sharing her work publicly at all. Not because she wasn't proud of it in the abstract, but because seeing others' responses to their own work made her own feel instantly inadequate by comparison. As we worked together, what emerged was that Jade had grown up the less academically celebrated sibling of a sister who had been consistently held up by their parents as the standard of achievement. Not cruelly, not intentionally, but consistently enough that Jade had absorbed a deep, early lesson that her worth was always evaluated relative to someone else's performance, never on its own terms. Social media had simply given that old internal mechanism an endless, inexhaustible supply of new reference points to run the same painful comparison on, and it was running it dozens of times a day. The turning point for Jade wasn't learning to ignore other people's success or pretending comparison didn't happen. The turning point was learning to interrupt the automatic next step that followed comparison in her mind, the step where the gap between her and someone else became a verdict on her worth rather than simply a piece of information about a difference. That interruption, practiced deliberately and repeatedly, gradually changed the emotional weight that comparison carried, without requiring her to stop noticing the world around her at all. So here's what actually helps. The first tool is something I call comparison awareness journaling, and it's deceptively simple. For 1 week, every time you notice a comparison arising, write down 3 things: who or what you're comparing yourself to, what specifically you're comparing on, and what information you actually have about that person's full reality as opposed to what you're seeing. Most people find, within a few days of this exercise, that the comparisons they're making are almost always based on extraordinarily incomplete information, and that seeing that incompleteness clearly reduces the emotional authority of the comparison considerably. The second tool is deliberately shifting from social comparison to what psychologists call temporal self-comparison, comparing yourself to who you were at an earlier point in your own life rather than to where someone else is right now. This isn't a forced positivity exercise, it's a genuine reorientation of the reference point your brain is using. Am I further along than I was a year ago? Have I learned something I didn't know before? Have I handled something I couldn't have handled earlier? These questions generate far more accurate and far more useful information about your actual trajectory than any comparison to another person's highlight reel ever could. The third tool is what I sometimes call consumption auditing, taking an honest, specific look at which platforms, accounts, or environments reliably trigger the most painful comparisons, and making deliberate choices about your exposure to them. This isn't about pretending the world doesn't exist or never looking at anyone else's work. It's about recognizing that certain specific inputs are consistently producing a specific emotional output in you and making an informed choice about how much of that input serves you versus drains you. Unfollowing an account that reliably makes you feel worse about your own life isn't avoidance, it's self-governance. A fourth tool is practicing what researchers call compression, a concept borrowed from relationship psychology that describes the experience of genuinely sharing in someone else's joy, rather than experiencing it as a threat to your own worth. This is harder to build than it sounds, because for people with strong upward comparison habits, other people's success has often been wired to feel like evidence of their own inadequacy, rather than a separate, independent event. But deliberately practicing congratulating others genuinely, noticing when someone's achievement inspires rather than deflates you, and cultivating relationships where other people's success feels like a shared good rather than a zero-sum loss, gradually rewires the emotional tone of comparison from threat to information. Now, some important cautions worth naming here. These tools are genuinely helpful for the everyday comparison patterns most people experience, including the kind that's significantly amplified by social media use. But if your comparison-driven distress has become severe enough that it's producing persistent depression, significantly interfering with your ability to function, or connected to a deeply held belief that you are fundamentally worthless or inadequate regardless of evidence, that's worth bringing directly to a licensed mental health professional, because there may be more underlying that benefits from structured clinical support. And reaching out for that support is a sign of genuine self-awareness, not weakness. So let's bring all of this together. Your brain compares because comparison was once a useful social navigation tool in a world of small, information-rich communities where you had accurate, complete data about the people around you. Today, that same mechanism is being applied to thousands of curated, filtered, strategically presented glimpses of other people's best moments, with none of the context that would make the comparison remotely fair or accurate. The comparison is made more painful by the fundamental structural unfairness of comparing your complete internal experience to other people's edited external presentation, and by the phenomenon of relative deprivation, where your brain's evaluation of what you have is constantly being shaped by what reference point it's using. By bringing awareness to when and how you compare, shifting your reference point toward your own earlier self rather than someone else's current highlight, making deliberate choices about what you consume and how much, and practicing genuine appreciation for other people's success as a separate event from your own worth, you begin to change the relationship your brain has with comparison, from a source of chronic inadequacy to, occasionally, a genuinely useful piece of information. If this video helped you understand your own comparison patterns a little better, I have a follow-up video right after this one on exactly how chronic stress physically reshapes the brain over time. And I think you'll find it just as worth your time, so go ahead and click through to that next. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss what's coming, and if someone in your life needs to hear this today, take a moment to send it their way. If you're struggling, please don't hesitate to reach out to one. Take care of yourself, and I'll see you in the next video.